Okay, everybody, so this is the second video lecture on the topic of lifespan development. I wanted to stop here in the last one because I wanted to talk about this concept of habituation. There's a lot of research done on small babies that are pre-verbal, and one of the ways that they do that research is because of this phenomena. So habituation, if you take that word apart, like habit, it means to become accustomed to something and therefore find it less interesting. So the idea that when a baby who is nonverbal and can't point, when they look longer at something, the idea is that that is new to them or novel, and that they look longer at things they like. So, well, I guess okay. So that does sound kind of paradoxical. So habituation means that we look towards things that we like, and in some cases, those are things that are familiar to us, or in some cases, those are things that are new to us, right? So, for instance, what research has been done on newborns is that they will look longer at, say, their mother's face than they will other faces. They will look longer at images that in your textbook you see. There's sort of a couple alien type things, and one of them has two dots at the top, and one at the bottom looks a little bit like a face, and the other one is sort of in reverse. And babies will look longer at the one with the two dots at the top, suggesting that they recognize faces generically, more than things that don't look like faces, but they'll look even longer at their mother's face. That babies will turn and look towards the sound of their mother's voice more than they will of other people's voices. That they will look towards where the smell of their mother, right? So this idea that, and later on, well, not in this class because that's in the human growth class, there's some research on what's called baby math and how cognitively, the complexities of what a baby can understand. And they use the same principle here of habituation, that when they look longer at something, it's something that's unusual, things that they don't like, or things that are not interesting to them, they won't look as long at. So the next time you have an encounter with a baby, one thing to notice, I remember learning about this myself, but one thing to notice is if they look at you, the longer they look at you, the more they like you, right? Or the more they find you interesting. If they don't look at you, then you're not interesting. My husband has a beard, and babies often look longer at beards, especially if their daddies don't have beards. Okay, I hope that made some sense. Habituation is meaning that they look longer at something. And even if they can't turn their head, they still can turn their eyes, or they still can shift their gaze. Motor development, when we start talking about infancy and child. So this is one of those. This is one of those examples about what we would refer to as development as opposed to growth. So growth is like literally people get taller or they get wider. Development is when the structures are able to do things they wouldn't before. So a fancy term here is this notion of maturation, which is the orderly sequence of biological growth. And one observation that has been made about motor development in children is that it happens in sequence. Now, I read this and then I think about my own daughter who was walking at 9 months. I don't remember her crawling. It doesn't mean that she didn't at some point wasn't able to be on her hands and knees. I maybe just didn't catch it. I just didn't observe it. But the point is that motor development is the sequence happens the same for normally developing children. So normally developing children will sit up before they're on their hands and knees. They'll stand before they walk, before they crawl. Now that one before they run. That kind of makes sense, right? You got to stand before you run. What is different is the timing of these things. And actually, walking has a fairly broad. So, my daughter was on the early end at 9 months, and my son was on the late end at I think he was closer to 16 months or 18 months before babies begin to walk. But clearly, you have to walk before you can run. And all of these things are dependent upon the development of brain structure. So, going back to the chapter 2, the chapter on brains, right? Brain structures. It is the cerebellum. It is the bell at the bottom of the brain that must develop before the rest of the brain can continue to control those motor movements. Right, so the cerebellum. Another really important part here is how the brain develops, or how the brain changes in response to more life. Really important concept here is this idea of synaptic pruning. So this is the classic use it or lose it kind of thing. So remember back in chapter 2, synapses are as a fancy word to talk about all the connections between the brain cells, right? So here in the blue over here, you have this is 36 weeks gestation before a child is born. You have the newborn, and then at about 6 months. So if you think about child development and how important I'm sure you've heard how critical those first 3 years of life are. That's because of this phenomena of synaptic pruning. So this is 6 months, this is 2 years, and you can see how thick, how many neural connections or possible neural connections there are in the brain. It's as if, well, not as if, it is, the brain is just, it is ripe for learning. It wants to learn. And the more neural connections, the more of those connections are used, the better, because those connections will then be reinforced. When we don't use the neural connections, it is quite literally use it or lose it, that those connections will be pruned. They will die, right? They will be cut away. So here you have this really thick, dense connections, and then by the time you get to 4 and 6 years, some of those connections have gotten really thick because they have habituated. They've happened over and over and over and over again. It's a lot like muscle memory. When you use your muscles over and over and over again, they get stronger. When you don't use those muscles, they die and they wither away. And the same thing happens to our synaptic connections, that when those neurons are fired over and over and over again, they become stronger. And that's what basically a memory, right? And when they're not used, they wither away. So this is what researchers call, sometimes you'll hear it referred to as a critical period. So a critical period refers to a time in our development where if we haven't learned something, we won't be able to learn it. An example of that is learning how to speak without an accent. So a critical period in speech is the first 5 years. That if a child has learned a language within the first 5 years of their life, they will have the accent and the dialect of a native speaker. If after 5 years they learn it, say, as a 12-year-old, they will always talk with an accent. And there are actually some sounds that if we have not learned, for, like in my case, roll your R, to roll an R, like to purr, right? If you don't learn that by a certain point, you won't learn it. I cannot learn it. The critical period has passed. So there's some that use the term critical period. Other textbooks use sensitive period, suggesting that this is when learning is particularly, like our brains are particularly sensitive to learning, but because of neuroplasticity that we've talked about in other chapters, you can still learn things later on. Point is synaptic pruning. We need an enriched environment. In your textbook, they have examples of rats. What we mean when we're talking about children is, do you set your kid in front of the TV, or do you give them lots of different things to learn about, right? Do we talk to our children? Do we read to our children? Do we lots of activities as opposed to just sitting in an empty room? There's a classic story about a girl named Jeannie, and she spent the first 11 years of her life effectively in her bedroom strapped to a potty seat, and she never learned how to talk, right? Because her environment was so impoverished. Other concepts introduced in this part of the chapter are the idea of infant memory versus infant amnesia. If I were to ask you to think back, like, to your first memory, probably chances are it wouldn't be before you were 3 years old. And it used to be, researchers referred to this as infantile amnesia and said that children we could not form memories before age 3. But since then, that has been discounted and said that that's really not accurate, because we know lots of things by the time we get to age 3. We know our name, we know that's our dog, we know our mother's face, we know how to walk, we know lots of things by the time we're age 3. But what we don't have, and I think I don't know, in the chapter on memory, if you've gotten to that one or not, we'll make reference to infantile amnesia as well. What we don't have by age 3 is we don't have a sense of self, right? We can't distinguish how we are separate from the environment, and we don't really have the complexity of understanding about like time and that abstract aspect. So we don't have episodic memories. We can't describe something that happened to us, but we have lots of memories. We know lots of stuff, but we don't have sort of a consciousness, a cognition of this happened in my abstract past. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and when we pick up, we will talk about more about baby cognition.